So, this thing. I'm sure that many of you have tried to use a Pokemon with flames on its body for an animation or a render, like Charizard, only to have this thing show up where its flames would normally be. This thing is evil, and very intimidating, and as someone who has a Charizard as their channel mascot, I was determined to try and find a way to erase this thing from existence. And now, after many long hours of on and off experimentation, and banging my head against the keyboard, I finally found a way to transform this into a replica of the flames from the 3DS Pokemon games. Well, kinda. There's still a few things I need to address before I start this tutorial. First, this video will only be covering 3 Pokemon lines: the Charizard line, the Delphox line, and Blaziken. The things I show in this video will apply to all of these Pokemon. There are some other Pokemon on the model resource that use these type of flames, but unfortunately I am not able to cover them at the moment either due to errors in the UV maps or having a setup that I have yet to figure out. If I didn't cover a Pokemon that you wanted to use, I'm very sorry, and I'll try to make a follow-up video if I find a way to address these things. Second, although this was never addressed in any of my previous tutorials, freestyle outlines will not work with these flames, so if you wanted to add an outline to your model, you may still run into some problems. And third, this may be my most technical tutorial yet, and due to that, I've decided to record this with post-commentary. Also, please feel free to ask me questions, but please make sure you watch the entire video carefully before you comment, as it may be hard for me to find where your problem lies with something like this. Also, since YouTube doesn't have an annotation system anymore, any changes or revisions that need to be made in the future will be stated in a pinned comment below, along with a timestamp. So if you're watching this far into the future, I recommend you take a quick look there before you continue. Now, with all of that out of the way, let me finally answer the mystery of how to fix the Pokemon flame textures in Blender. So I've opened up Blender and imported the .dae file for Charizard. I'm using Charizard as a basic example as to how to create these flames due to it being one of the simplest setups. Again, what you see here should apply to the rest of the Pokemon you will see in this video, with a few small exceptions that I will show later on. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go to the world settings and turn on ambient occlusion and environment lighting. I'm also going to lower the AO value a bit. You don't have to copy my world settings in order to get the flames to work, or even use AO at all. This just lets me give you a clear view of the model and what's going on. Now, I'm going to open a few more windows by going over to this corner and dragging out some new viewports. This top window here will be used for our dope sheet, so I'm going to click here and then select dope sheet. This bottom window will simply be used as a camera view, so I'm going to go down here, click view, and then camera. I'm also going to zoom in a bit, so the camera view can better match the window. Now let's move the camera closer to the shell on the tail, so that our renders will let us see how the flame looks. If we change our display to preview our render, we will see that evil shell in its entirety, the thing that stands between us and that beautiful flame that we are hoping to create. We are going to keep our camera view here, and then right-click the model in order to select it. Now with our model selected, we can check out its materials. Near the bottom, you should see 2 black and white colored materials that correspond to this shell. The reason there are 2 materials is because there are actually 2 different parts to this setup, the shell and the core. These 2 materials each represent one of those 2 parts. Let's get a better look. If we go into edit mode, and then click this button here, we can see all of the model's vertices, including the ones hidden behind other faces. If you look at the shell, you should see something inside of it now. That is the core of the flame. If we go over to this list of materials again, we can press this giant select button in order to select all of the vertices that this material is assigned to. While we are not going to be doing anything regarding the model yet, this will help to let us see which of these materials is the core and which is the shell, as it is very important to make that distinction. By clicking this material and then pressing the select button, we can see that the vertices inside the shell become selected, so that means that this material is the one assigned to the core. I'll press the A key to deselect all of these vertices, and then go over to the other material and repeat the process. As you can see, this material let us select the outer part of the shell, so the second material is assigned to the shell. Now before we continue, I think I should explain in greater detail as to how these black and white textures are going to help us make the flame. Basically what is going to happen is that we are going to use these textures to calculate the alpha of the shell and the core, apply color to both of them using the diffuse bar, and then overlay the shell's texture on top of the cores. Alpha is kind of like a transparency setting for images. To put it simply, if part of an image has an alpha setting of 1, it is visible. If it has 0, it is invisible, and you can easily overlay it in front of other stuff. These black and white textures represent alpha values, and tells Blender what part of the model should be visible. White parts remain visible, and black parts become transparent. Now with that explanation out of the way, I'm going to start editing these materials in order to make them appear like we want to, starting with the shell's material. Like any other material on any Pokemon model, you will probably want to set specular to 0 in order to avoid weird white spots. I'm going to turn on shadeless, so the flame isn't affected by lighting. Keep in mind that this will also keep the shading of the flame consistent, regardless of how dark or bright your scene is. Next, I'm going to go down and turn off traceable. This excludes the object from anything that has to do with shadows, so it won't receive any shadows, nor will it cast any. This is not entirely the result we want, but that will be addressed later. Under the transparency settings, I'm going to set the alpha bar to 0. At the moment, this will just make the entire shell invisible, but this will change once we calculate the alpha value of the texture. You can also see what the core currently looks like. That will also change in a bit. Let's go to the texture settings now and take a look at the shell's textures. Right now, there's only one texture here. This is the first part of the texture that will appear as a projection on the core. In the model's files, these textures are always labeled as Fire-Type, and any texture with this name is involved with the shell. Before we add the other textures, let's get this one all set up. First, we will want to go down under Image Sampling and turn on Calculate. Then down here under Influence, we will want to turn Color off, because we don't want our flame to be black and white, and turn on Alpha. As you can see here, Blender has made only certain parts of the model visible. This is because we have allowed Blender to calculate the material's alpha using this black and white texture. Only the white parts on the shell are visible now, which is what we want. Now, let's go back and add that second shell texture. In our texture list, you will want to select a new spot, and then click New. By default, it will bring us to the texture type of importing an image or a movie, which is what we want to do. So down here, click Open. From here, you will want to go to the texture files of the Pokemon that you are working on, which in this case is Charizard, and import the second Fire-Type texture. You can tell the two textures apart by looking at the letter and the number that appears at the end of their names. A1 is the texture that we just worked on, and the one that will always appear on the model when we first import it. A2 is the second texture that we will want to import now. It's also important to note that if you're working on a Pokemon that can Mega Evolve, again, like Charizard, there may be more than one set of textures with similar names. This is due to Mega Evolved Pokemon having their own textures, even when it comes to the flames. You can tell the normal textures apart from the Mega ones by looking at the number before the texture's title. If it's 00, then it's the normal form. If it's 51, then it's Mega. In the case of Charizard specifically, 51 is Charizard X and 52 is Charizard Y. Now that we've imported the second stem texture, we will want to set it up in the same way that we did the first one, although with one extra step. Under Color, we will want to increase the texture's RGB value to 2. This will help make part of the texture a bit more visible later. Now let's repeat what we did before. It's not as noticeable as the first texture, but it lets us do a little bit more to the animation on the flame. Now if we go back out to the material settings, we can see that the material is now entirely white with parts missing from it. This is now our opportunity to color it using this diffuse bar. The color of this material is the one that we will be moving around the core, as well as the color at the flame's base. You can make this whatever you want, but for replicating Charizard's tail flame from the 3DS games, I find these to be the best color values. The colors may slightly differ for other Pokemon, but I'll make sure to note any that have any different colors later. The shell's material is finished, at least for the time being. Now let's start editing the core's material. First, let's do the same thing we did to the shell's material settings earlier. With that all set up, let's go to the materials texture settings. Like the textures for the shell, we are going to need to use two of these black and white images in order to get the effect we want. The textures that we are associating with the core are labeled Fire Core in the model's files. We will want to import the second core texture as soon as we're finished with the first one. The texture settings are the exact same as the textures on the shell. Now let's add the other core texture. Remember, you can distinguish the two core textures apart by looking at the end of their file names. Once again, the setup is the same, though, unlike the second shell texture, you don't need to worry about increasing the RGB values for this one. Back in the material settings again, it's time to give a color to the main part of the core, basically every area that isn't covered by the shell's texture. Again, you can make this whatever you want, but for accuracy, I'm going to use these values. Now, after all that, our tail flame should look something like this. Although the colors are correct, the area around the core still looks like a shell, and we want that shell to project its texture onto the core, so now we'll be focusing on how to do that. Pay very close attention, as this is where things could get a little bit more crazy. First, I'm going to select the shell's material while still in edit mode, and then select its vertices. Now with all of these vertices selected, I'm going to press the P key and then separate by selection. With that, the shell has just become its own separate object. So now we can individually select it from the rest of the model, and we can do things like move it around, and as we'll see later, move it to different layers. Let's do the same thing for the core now. I'm going to reselect the main part of the model, and then repeat the same step for the core's material. Now the core is also its own object. In order to easily distinguish these new objects, I'm going to go over to the Object settings and rename the core in the shell. Our selected object's name can be changed here, which at this moment is the shell. The reason it has this name is due to the shell's object sharing its name with the Charizard model, and the number on the right will increase for different objects that share the same name. So for example, the flame core is currently called Charizard.002, due to it being the second object to be created with the name Charizard. Let's rename the shell to something simple like Fire Shell, and then move on to the core. I just selected the core through the shell despite not being able to see it. If two or more objects are in the same location, you can re-click that spot again in order to select the other objects. Remember, the name of the object you currently have selected can be seen at any time by looking at this white text at the bottom left of the 3D window. Now, let's rename the core object to Fire Core. With the names out of the way, I'm going to move over to the render layer settings. So a quick explanation as to what these are. Render layers let us, as the name would suggest, separate our render into different layers. This can be used for many different purposes, like adding or removing effects from individual elements in your render. But the main thing we are going to be using it for is for shadows and overlaying the shell on top of the core. From the beginning, we will always have one render layer simply titled Render Layer. You can keep this name the same if you want, but I'm going to change it to Main just to organize things a little bit more. Over here we can see a lot of small squares that represent the different slots for layers that we can move our objects to. And here we can choose which slots we want to assign to this main render layer. When you import something into Blender, it will usually import into whatever slots are currently active in your scene. And by default, the only active slot will be the top left one. So since this is going to be our main render layer that contains most of our objects, we are going to select that one, which automatically deselects the rest of the slots. Now if we go down under passes, we can see a bunch of different buttons that represent certain aspects of our layer. For what we are going to need to do later, we are going to want to turn on Material Index, Shadow, AO, and for some reason I turn on Environment here, but it turns out we won't really be using that, so feel free to keep that off. The properties of our main render layer are now all set up, so let's start adding some render layers that will be used for the flame. Press this plus button here to add a new render layer, and then rename it to Core. This layer will contain nothing but the core, and we are going to assign it to this slot. Like the main layer, we are going to want to turn on Material Index, Shadow, AO, with environment being optional. We are also going to want to uncheck sky, which will make the background of this layer transparent, so we can easily overlay it on top of other layers. Okay, so this is something that I forgot to directly showcase, but by the time you render your final shot, you will want to go down here to Mask Layer, and then select the slot that our main render layer is on. You will also want to do this for the next render layer that we will be making. This makes it so that the flame isn't overlaid in front of everything, and that the body or any other object on the main render layer will block the view of the flame accordingly. The effects of not having this set up won't be apparent from this demonstration, but trust me, you will want to remember to do this. So now, let's add our final render layer, and name it Shell. Then like the other two, we're going to select a slot for it, in which case I recommend this third slot, and then copy the passes from the core render layer. Again, also remember to set the mask layer, even though it isn't shown here. All three of our render layers are now set up, so let's start moving some objects to these new layers. Back in the 3D view, let's select the shell and then press the M key. This will bring up a menu that has those slots from earlier, and now we can decide what layer we want this object to exist on. Since we want to move the shell to the shell render layer, we are going to select the slot that we assigned to this layer earlier, which is this one. Now the shell has disappeared, but don't freak out, it isn't gone, it just exists on a different render layer now. Let's do the same thing with the core. As you can see over here, we assigned this slot to the core render layer, so we are going to move the core object there. Now both the core and the shell have disappeared, but how can we view them again? Well, if we go to these boxes down here, we can see some dots inside the slots that have objects in them. So if we select this core layer slot, it will only display objects that are on this layer. It's also important to note that in order to preview a render, you must have the appropriate layer selected up here, as well as having it displayable down here. Otherwise, you will usually end up with a blank preview. Let's check out the shell by going to its render layer. As you can see, both of these objects are now isolated from the rest of the scene and from each other, and we can now individually composite these things together in order to get the effects we want. If you want all of these layers to be displayable at once, you can go down and shift-click all of these boxes. Blender will only render the layers that are currently being displayed, so if you're going to render your image, you want to make sure that all of these are enabled. With all that done, it's time to move on to the node editor. Now the node editor can look very intimidating if you're using it for the first time. To put it simply, it's a giant connect the dots looking system that works by routing certain aspects of a scene through various boxes in order to add or remove certain details. The node editor, in combination with render layers, allow for almost endless possibilities when it comes to composition. This can make it a little overwhelming at first, but as long as you pay very close attention, things should end up fine. Though I will say up front, if you wish to composite your flame into a live action scene, a different setup will be required, and I will show you how to do that at the end of the video. Regardless of what your render is, I still recommend paying very close attention to these upcoming steps. Right now, we're in the node editor for the materials, and despite editing those black and white materials earlier, this isn't where we want to be. So down here, I'm going to press this button to change it from material editing to scene editing. Now let's add our first nodes. Right next to those three buttons, let's turn on Use Nodes so we can actually add the nodes, and then Backdrop, so an image of our render can appear behind said nodes. Now we have our two basic nodes, the composite node, which is where we put our final render, and a node for our main render layer. If you look even closer, the node for our main render layer has additional dots for the passes that we enabled earlier in the render layer settings, which is why we needed to turn those on. Now before I get to editing these nodes, I want to get our backdrop completely set up, and to do that, we need to have a rendered image, and a viewer node. So I'm going to render our image real quick, which we can do up here, and then go back to the node editor, and go down under Add, Output, and then Viewer in order to add a viewer node, which I'll place below the composite node. Please note that the position of these nodes in this space doesn't actually affect the final render. It's just these lines and dots that do. Now, let's drag out a line from our main render layer's image pass and connect it to the viewers. Now we have a nice background behind our nodes, and this will usually change in order to reflect the settings that we have added or removed. There are a few times where it might become inaccurate though, so I would recommend re-rendering your image once in a while just to make sure you're right on track. It's time to start the actual editing process. I'm going to drag this main render layer away a bit, just to give us a little bit more room to work with. And then with this node still selected, I'm going to duplicate it 2 times using Shift D. Selecting nodes works the same way as selecting objects in the 3D view, so keep that in mind. Now we have 3 of these render layer nodes, and we're going to make these 2 new ones use the other 2 layers for editing. So let's go to this button underneath this render layer, click it, and then change the layer to core. Now it's displaying our core layer inside the box, so it will use its properties. Down here, let's do the same thing for the shell layer. With our render layers now all set up, we can now link all of these nodes together in order to merge the flame in the core, and then overlay that on top of the tail. Let's add another node, with this one being under color, and then mix. We'll move that here, and then change its blend type from mix to add. We'll also want to click this button here. Right above that, we have a little icon that is the same one used for the materials settings. If we click this, a small window will open up, which will let us see the result of the 2 things that we mixed together. Now, let's drag our core's image pass into this top slot here, and then the shells into the bottom one. Keep in mind that the places in which these dots are connected can affect the final render. For instance, you wouldn't want to put the core's line into the bottom slot and vice versa. So remember to keep track as to where I put these lines. If we get a closer look, you can see that by adding these 2 layers together like this, it gives off the illusion that the shell's textures are actually part of the core itself. This is probably the biggest step as to fixing these flames, but we still have plenty that we need to go over. Let's go back to Add, Color, and then choose Alpha Over. This node lets us overlay images on top of other images, given the right conditions. We're going to route this newly combined flame into the bottom slot of this node, and then put the main layer's image into the top slot. Now let's connect this alpha over node to both the composite and the viewer nodes. The background is changed to show us how our render looks now. The shell is still present here, but luckily, that can be easily fixed by going to the alpha over node and then pressing Convert Primal. Just doing some readjusting to the location of the node real quick. There we go. The flame and the shell are now combined together, and this is what should appear in our render. It should be noted that some models will still occasionally have small lines around the flame at this point. If the model you're working on has these lines, just connect the core's alpha pass to the FAC slot of the alpha over node. There's still some things that don't look quite right, so let's focus on fixing some of those smaller details now. Let's go back to the 3D view and add some shadows to our scene. I'm going to press Shift S in order to bring up this menu, and then select Cursor to Center. That way, when we add the plane for our shadows, it will spawn right in the center of our scene. Speaking of which, let's add our plane by going up here under Create, and then selecting Plane. I'm also going to press S in order to scale our plane up so the shadows won't suddenly be cut off. I want to change around the lighting a bit, so we can get some more vivid looking shadows. Right now, we have our default lamp from when we first open up Blender, so I'm going to select that, then go over to the lamp settings, and change the lamp's type to sun. You don't have to use a sun lamp for your render, I'm just using one so I can easily control the shadows. Going back to the render layer settings, I'm going to display the main render layer, turn on the rotation tool, and then rotate the lamp a bit until we can see the tail shadow. The reason I'm doing all of this shadow work is to showcase a small problem that currently exists with our flame. If we render our image, the problem will become apparent. As you can see, our flame doesn't cast a shadow onto the scene. Although this may not seem like a big deal, shadows are a big part of establishing an object's location and properties, and without a shadow, the flame could stand out from the rest of the scene, which we don't want. Now the fix may seem obvious at first. We could just select the model, or the flame or the core, they share the same materials so we can edit them from any of these objects, go to the core's material, and then turn traceable back on so it casts a shadow. The problem is, turning traceable back on will also cast a giant ugly dark spot onto the tip of the tail, or anywhere close to where the flames are on the Pokemon. And the shadow the core does cast also doesn't take transparency into account, so we can get some inaccuracies. Due to this, we can't use this core for casting shadows, which makes things a bit more complicated. So, how do we fix these two things? Well, I'll show you how, starting with the easier of the two problems. Let's select our plane, and then give it a new material. Remember to turn specular to 0, as this could cause some display issues for later. All we need to do to fix the inaccurate shadow is scroll down to the material's shadow settings and turn on Receive Transparent. Now if we go back to the core material and turn Traceable back on, we can see that the shadow is accurately reflecting the shape of the flame onto the floor. However, we still have this big black spot to deal with, and removing this requires a lot more work. Make sure you pay very close attention, as it could be easy to forget some things here. So what we have to do in order to remove that black spot but keep the core's cast is to add a new scene. Don't get these confused with render layers. A scene contains all of the information that we've worked on so far, from our objects to our node setup. Having multiple scenes lets us set up completely different renders without having to create a new blend file, and then later we can move or link between the two scenes with ease. Before we add a new scene, I'm going to name the one that we've been working in so far. Just something simple like main scene should be fine. But you can keep the default name if you want to. Now, when we press this plus button, it's going to give us a few options on how we want to start up our new scene. Just select Copy Settings. Well, everything just vanished. That's because this new scene doesn't have anything in it yet. The scene is a completely empty slate, with one exception, which I'll show in a second. Don't worry though, we can return to our old scene whenever we want to. We'll just be using this scene for shadows exclusively. Before we start messing around with this new space, I'm going to rename this scene to Shadow Scene, just so we can find it easily in the future. Let's check out our render settings now. You probably can't tell from this, but our render settings have remained the same, even though we've opened a new scene. This is due to us selecting Copy Settings earlier. All that does, to my knowledge, is copy the render settings from your first scene to the new one. However, it won't keep them consistent, so if you have yet to set up your render settings, or you change them after doing this, you'll need to go to the render settings of both scenes and change them accordingly. This is very important, as it could cause some weird problems otherwise. If you go to the world settings, you will see that we actually don't have one at the moment. You don't get to see this that often, because Blender opens up with a world already in place. We want our worlds to remain consistent between the two scenes, so instead of adding a new one, let's just click here, and then use the one from our main scene. Since we are using the same world for both scenes, changing its settings here will also change them for our main scene, and vice versa. This also applies for things like materials. Let's head back to our main scene for a bit by clicking right here and then selecting Main Scene. We are going to link a few of our objects to this new scene. Again, this will make it so some of our objects will remain consistent between the two scenes, unlike the render settings. I'm going to start by linking our camera, so I'll select that and then press Ctrl L. After this menu pops up, we're going to want to go to Objects to Scene, which our mouse is already on, and then select our shadow scene. We're going to want to do this with our lamp, our plane, and if we go down here to change the viewable layers, we're also going to want to do this with our flame core. If at any point after this you add more lamps or structures to the main scene, remember to link them to the shadow scene, or else you'll get some inconsistencies. If we go back to the shadow scene now, we'll see that all of the objects we've linked are now here as well, except for the core, which appears to be missing. That is because the core was moved to this scene's version of this layer slot. It won't have much use here, so we're going to want to move it to the first slot. But before we do that, we have some editing to do. I'm going to want to select the core and then duplicate it. Then I will right click to put it back in the same exact place it was before. Right now we have two fire cores in the same spot, so we're going to want to rename this one to tell them apart. I'll just be naming it Shadow Core. Now let's go to the Shadow Core's materials and make sure we have the core material selected. I'm going to press this plus button here in order to give the shadow core its own version of the material, so we can change its options without having to worry about how it'll affect the regular core. We're going to want to go here and turn traceable on, as well as cast only. This will make the core completely invisible, but it will still cast a shadow onto the floor despite of that. Now it's time to move our shadow core to the first layer, so make sure it is still selected, and then press M to move it there. This core left over here is now just our regular fire core. We won't be needing it in the scene any longer, so you can go ahead and delete it. This will only delete it from this scene, so the core is still present in our main scene. If we go back to our first layer slot, you can see through the preview now that the core is casting a shadow onto the ground, and this core will still be affected by the changes in Charizard's armature from the other scene, so this shadow will follow the flame as the tail moves. I'm going to make a quick render, since it'll help us when compositing this with the node editor. With that, we can go back to our main scene, make sure all of the layers we are using are visible, and start work on adding this shadow to our main render. My preview became disconnected from the camera, fixing that real quick. Also, we'll want to go back to the shadow scene again real quick just to adjust the render layer settings there. I forgot to turn on the passes earlier, so I'm going to do that now. Now we can go off to our main scene for real this time, and then head off to the node editor. To start off, we're going to be adding a lot more nodes, so I'm going to reorganize our current nodes a bit just so we can have a lot more space to work with. Okay, time to add the shadow to our render. I'm going to duplicate this top render layer node, and then click this button here, and change our scene to the shadow scene. If you look at the box, you can see the previous render that we made in said scene. This will let the shadow show up when we mix it with our other images, and give us an idea of how our progress is going. Let's add a new type of node, by going to Add, Color, and then Invert. Despite what the dots on the node would suggest, we're going to put our shadow scene's alpha pass into the color slot of the invert node. After that, we're going to add another mix node. Change it to add, and then duplicate it like so. Connect the invert node to the top slot of both of these add nodes. As for the bottom slots, connect the shadow scene's shadow pass to the top node and the AO pass to the bottom. Now, add another mix node and change its type to multiply. Afterwards, join both of the add nodes together through this multiply node. Duplicate the multiply node and move it down a bit closer to the viewer and composite nodes. Then put our first multiply node into the bottom slot of the second and the alpha over node into the top slot. Once this is done, connect this multiply node to both the composite node and the viewer node so our render can add the additions to our setup. My backdrop just became blank. This may or may not happen to you after doing this, but if it does, just re-render your image and you should see the full result of our work. There we go. The core's shadow is now in the same image as the rest of the objects, but unfortunately things still don't look quite right. The shadow is way too dark, especially when compared to the shadow that the tail is casting. It's also overlaying the tail's shadow instead of blending in with it, which doesn't make it look very good. We're going to need a little bit more node work in order to fix this, but first, let's head back to the 3D view. Select the plane, and then go to its material settings. We're going to want to give our material a pass index number. This setting directly works with another node that we'll be using shortly. The number that you put here can be anything you want as long as it isn't shared by any other material. The default number is 0, so you're going to want to make it higher than that. I'm going to use 10. Let's go back to the node editor now in order to finish the compositing. Go down here to Add again. Under Converter, select ID Mask. There's an index number on this node. You'll want to make this the same number you gave to the plane's material earlier, which for me is 10. Connect the index material pass of the main render layer node into the ID value of this new ID Mask node. After that, once again go down to Add and then Converter, but this time select Math. Once you have placed it, change its operation from add to multiply. Put this ID mask into the bottom slot of this multiply node, and then put the main layer's shadow pass into the top slot. Since we are multiplying the values of these two things, the exact slots that we put them into shouldn't matter, unlike the other nodes. So if it's more convenient to switch the top and bottom slots, I'm pretty sure you can do that, though I'm not entirely positive. Duplicate to add a second multiply node, and then link the two of them together. This time, use the main layer's AO pass instead of the shadow pass. Duplicate a third multiply node, and once again link the two together. The value for a second slot this time will require a little bit more setup. Go down around the cores node, and then add a new invert node. Put the alpha value of the core into this slot, and then link our invert node and our multiply node together. Now let's duplicate our fourth and final multiply node, and connect them together for the third time. This multiply node's bottom slot is going to be left blank, so we can manually adjust it as we see fit. And finally, connect all of these math multiply nodes to the color multiply node's FAC slot. Our shadow may have just disappeared, but if we re-render our image, our shadow now has somewhat normal coloring to it, and it's being cut off by the other shadows in our scene. This is what we want. However, the core's shadow still looks quite a bit darker from the tails. Luckily, this is what that fourth multiply node was for. If we go back to that node, we can manually adjust the second value, which just so happens to make the core's shadow brighter or darker. You can make this whatever you want in order to make the core's shadow match the rest of your scene. That being said, you'll probably need to experiment a bit before you find the right value. I think 0.25 is pretty close, so I'll keep it there. And with that, we are completely done with the node editor, at least when it comes to the flame. We're almost done, and everything else from here is both easy and fun. Let's return to the 3D view. Before we get to adding the finishing touches to the flame, display only the cores layer, and then select the core. Press M, and then shift-click the shell layer. The reason we are putting the core into the shells layer in addition to this one is for something very situational. If you have multiple versions of these flames lined up together, it could create some weird effects, and doing this prevents those effects from showing up. I could have done this a lot earlier, but it doesn't really matter when you do it, as long as it's before your final render, so I did it here. Back to displaying all three layers in our 3D view, we'll want our render preview to display the shells layer for what we're going to be doing next. So let's go to the render layer settings and select it from the list. As you can see, in addition to potentially preventing weird overlapping fire effects, we now have a preview of both the core and the shell present, which will help us immensely going forward. Go to the materials settings and then select the shells material. Again, the object you select while doing so shouldn't matter, because they all have the same materials in their lists. What we're going to work on now is adding the flame's fade. as well as its base, which will always remain highlighted with the shell's color. So with this material selected, go into its texture settings. We're going to want to add a new texture to our list. This mainly acts as a showcase rather than an instruction, but if I open a new texture from Charizard's texture files called Fire-Type Mask, we will get something like this. Now this texture may seem very weird and simplistic, but the image is actually how the 3D Pokemon games apply the fade to the Flame's core. You can see this if we go down here and switch the influence from color to alpha. No need to calculate this texture. If you look at the core now, the very top of the shell has become whole again, and because of our node setup, that will be reflected back onto the flame, so the top part of the core will now be a solid yellow. However, we want this to be reversed, with there being no yellow at the top. This is easily fixed by changing the blend type from mix to subtract. Now check out the shell's textures. There's no yellow to be seen at the top. This is due to the mask now subtracting from the shell's alpha instead of adding to it, and this causes the flames to gradually fade out as they get closer to the top. I'm going to render my image real quick, just to showcase this a bit further. The yellow parts that used to be at the top of the core have disappeared, which helps to make the flame look a little bit more authentic. Now, you're probably wondering why I said this was more of a showcase than an instruction earlier. Well, that's because we aren't actually going to be using this mask texture for our final render. I mainly showcased it to give you a general idea of what these textures are used for, and how we're going to achieve this effect. The reason we aren't using this mask texture is due to its quality. If you continue to use this texture, the fade applied to the core would look quite blocky as it started to reach the top. And although this isn't noticeable with the 3DS's resolution, if you're making a high quality render, this could become very apparent. That being said, if your goal is to make a 3DS style render, then go ahead and use this texture. But otherwise, just delete it by pressing this X button, and I'll show you how to get a smoother fade on the core. Let's once again make a new texture using this newly opened spot, and instead of using an image or movie, change the image type to blend. By looking at our image preview, you may already be able to tell where this is going. Go down here under the blend settings, and change the progression from linear to easing. We'll also want the texture to be set up vertically. Now let's turn on the color ramp up here. If you look down at our preview, you may have already noticed that the fade is already being applied to our shell, and the color ramp will allow us to edit this with greater detail. What the ramp allows us to do in this sense is control the position and power of the fade. So for example, if we move this black marker to the right, the fade will become weaker, and the yellow flames can reach higher up on the core before they disappear. In contrast, if we move this white marker to the left, the fade will become stronger, and the flames will fade out quicker. You can mess around with this all you want if you wish to create a unique fade for your flame, or you don't like how my fade looks in my final render. Also, we'll want to remember to set the interpolation to ease as well, along with the progression. Now let's go down and do the same thing we did for the mask texture. Change the influence from color to alpha, and then set the blend to subtract. As you can see, we're getting a really similar result, though now we have more customization options, and the fade will be smoother. Now for where we're going to position these markers on our ramp. For the first blend texture on Charizard, I usually like to keep its default positions. Some Pokemon may have different values in their blend textures in order to get a similar fade to the 3DS, but if there's any difference in the other Pokemon, I'll be covering it in this video. Now the fade on the flame is done, let's move on to the flame's base. We're going to create a second blend texture, and once again change its progression to easing, make it vertical, turn on the ramp, and set the interpolation to ease. Change the influence from color to alpha, but this time, leave the blend as it is on mix. Below the ramp button, there's this uniquely shaped icon. This will flip the color ramp around. So in our case, this will reverse the direction of the fade. Click it, and if you look here, there's now a solid yellow part at the bottom of the shell. Because we kept the blend type on mix, it'll add alpha instead of subtracting it. If we render the image now, you can see that this not only makes the stem texture appear as if it's coming out of this yellow space, but adds a small orange fade to the core. This helps to hide some weird texture maps below the flame, as well as to make the flame look more colorful. Adjusting the ramp on this blend texture will make the yellow space and fade bigger or smaller depending on how you position your markers. Something also worth noting is that you can precisely set the marker's positions by changing the value on this bar here. Unlike the last texture, we aren't going to be using the default positions here. For the white marker, I would place it around 0.1 or 0.05. For the black marker, 0.6 is usually a nice spot. Now let's render our image one more time. Looks great, doesn't it? To think that this flame was a giant black and white mess when we started out, and now it looks like this. When it comes to the flame's general appearance, that's it. Congratulations on creating your flame. Remember though, you can still customize this however you'd like. So let's say for the sake of example, you wanted to create some sort of alien flame. You could easily change the colors on the corn shell's materials and make whatever you want. You can also adjust the fade by editing the color ramp on the blend textures. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the appearance. Now the only thing left to do is to animate the textures. Take a look at the timeline down here. You will probably want to make adjustments to this before you start setting keyframes. First, we're going to want to set our starting frame and current position to frame 0. Here you will want to set the end frame of your animation. A second in Blender is set to 24 frames by default, but I usually change this to 30 in the render settings, so we're going to be working with that frame rate. As for how long I want this animation to be, I'm going to have it end after 300 frames. At 30 frames per second, that's 10 seconds. You'll probably want to change this depending on how long you want your animation to be, but for the sake of demonstration, I'll be using 300 frames. Now let's get to actually animating the textures on the two materials, starting with the core. Go to its texture settings, and then select the first core texture from the list. Scroll down to these 3 bars here. These bars let us change the offset of the texture, and by keyframing this, we can make the texture move. As to what part of the flame this texture moves specifically, animating this will give it a sort of wavy effect, which will make it look more active and alive. So again, make absolutely sure that you're on frame 0, then put your mouse over the bars and press the I key. The bars are now yellow, which signifies that they have a keyframe set on our current frame. You can also see these yellow diamonds have appeared up in our dope sheet. These diamonds let us see where we've set all of our keyframes, and we can move these around however we like, but we won't need to tamper with them just yet. Back down here in the timeline, or the dope sheet if you would prefer, move over to the end frame of your animation, which for me is 300. Now we can set a new offset value and keyframe in order to make the texture move. Depending on the number we set, the flame will move in a particular way at a particular speed. You can experiment with this if you want to do something unique with your flame, but I'll be showing you what I find to be the values that mirror the movements from the 3DS games. In order to get the appropriate values, we're going to need to do a bit of math. We're only going to be changing the value on the Y offset bar, but in order to get the right speed at 30 frames per second, the bar needs to move at negative 0.05 offset per frame. That's negative 1 offset for every 20 frames, or negative 5 offset for every 100 frames. My animation is 300 frames long, so I'm going to want to set my Y offset to negative 15. Since your animation is probably a different length than mine, you'll need to calculate what number you should put in here. So for instance, if your animation is 200 frames long, you'll want this Y offset to be negative 10, and if it's 500 frames long, negative 25 is the correct number. So unless the animation you're making is exactly 300 frames long, you probably won't be using this number. Now with your numbers set, add a second keyframe to the offset value. If you move up to the dope sheet and scroll over, you can see the new keyframes that we've added. If your animation is long enough, you may not be able to see both of your keyframes on the window at once. To make things easier, go down to the end of this bar, and then drag it to the left until you see both sets of keyframes. This will make the gap between each frame smaller, so you can see bigger milestones. However, if you plan on animating your Pokemon after this tutorial, which I assume you do, I would change this back as soon as the flame's animation is done, because it can make adjusting keyframes that are close together pretty difficult. Now let's move on to the second core texture. Animating the offset of this texture will move the embers surrounding the flame. Before we do any keyframing, remember to go back to frame 0 and set your first keyframe without any offset. This can be easy to forget, so make sure that you do this. Back on frame 300, the value that we're going to be setting will once again only involve the Y-axis, but unlike last time, we're going to make the number double that of the offset of the first core texture, so for me that's negative 30. Again, this may vary for you depending on your animation length. We're all done animating the core's textures, but before we move on to the shells, we're going to want to add a new material. This may seem out of nowhere, but we also want to make sure that the core's shadow moves along with its brighter counterpart. If we click here, we can see all of the materials that we've made from all of our scenes, including the one for the shadow core. If you didn't rename it, it should look something like this, without an icon and with that duplicate number thing I was talking about earlier. Select this material. Although this material may appear on the material list of our selected object, it won't really do much, because it isn't assigned to anything on the object itself. Regardless, go into its texture settings. We're also going to want to keyframe the offset on both of these materials' textures as well. Since these textures are technically the same ones that we just worked on, we'll want to give them the exact same offset values. Nothing that's new, so I'll just go through these real quick. Another reason we are bringing this material into this list is because its keyframes will now show up on the dope sheet, where it wouldn't otherwise. Now let's move on to the shell's textures. Once again, start with the first texture in the list, and then move down to the offset bars. This first shell texture will make the yellow stripe on the core move. Set your keyframe on frame 0, and then on your end frame, the operation for the y-axis is the same as the first texture we worked on, negative 0.05 per frame. However, this time we are also going to be editing the x-axis. For here, divide the number in your y-axis by 3, and put the result in the x-axis. That's negative 5 for me. Keyframe the offset, and then move on to the last texture that we'll be animating, which is this one. This texture doesn't animate a particularly noticeable part of the flame, but it does cause some small yellow lines to appear from the bottom of the core, before quickly fading out. Still nice to have. And for our final number, put in the exact same value for the Y offset as your last texture, but don't mess with the X offset. And now, there's only a few more steps we need to do, and your flame will be complete. Go up to the dope sheet, and make sure that all of the keyframes regarding your materials are selected. The reason I say that is because if you've already animated something in your scene, be it your model or otherwise, you won't want to apply this upcoming effect to it, or it can mess up your animation quite a bit. If you haven't animated anything yet, like myself, then you can just move on to the next step. But if you have, the row of keyframes that you are looking to select will have the core, shell, and shadow core's names to the left of your keyframes. It's something you'll want to remember if you're applying this mid-project. Anyway, the very last thing that we need to do is go to Key, Interpolation Mode, and then Linear. This makes the textures move at a constant rate. So instead of having the textures speed up or slow down as the offsets travel to their destinations, which would look weird, they will always move at the exact same speed. If we go to frame 0 and skip ahead in frames using the arrow keys, we can see this at work, as the flame is moving at a steady pace. And with that, your flame is complete. Congratulations! Now if you render your animation, the flame should look something like this, and you can rejoice knowing that you can finally put your Charizard into that animation you've been dying to make. The rest of the video will go over the slight differences between the flames on Charizard and the flames on some other Pokemon. After that, I'll show you the node setup for compositing this flame into live action, because that requires a slightly different setup from the one here. But if you're watching this video for Charizard specifically, and your animation isn't live action, then your flame work is done, and you can stop watching the video. As for everyone else, here are the times where I start to cover a specific Pokemon, as well as the live action node setup. Continuing on from here, I'll start with the rest of the Charizard line. Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard Y are easy. Their setups are the exact same for normal Charizard. Same colors, same ramp positions, same everything. The only thing about Charizard Y is that you need to remember to use its flame textures, and not normal Charizard's. Charizard X is where things get a little bit tricky though, and not just for the reasons that you might think. Something that I want to get out of the way real quick. If you look at these materials, you may notice that they have those duplicate numbers in their names. This is because I imported this model into the same blend file that I used for the main part of this tutorial and have the other models hidden. Since these materials share their names with the materials on the previous Charizard models, it put those duplicate numbers there. Just ignore them, because if you import these models alone, these numbers won't be there. Same thing goes with the name of the armature. Anyway, what you're seeing here is the model before I colored the materials and separated the flame objects. The reason I'm showing this now is because fixing this problem after you've done all of these things can be very hard, or maybe even impossible. So you'll preferably want to do what I'm about to show you before you do the main bulk of the work from the tutorial. To show you what I mean, select the model's armature and then go to the armature settings. Set the display to stick and turn X-ray on, so we can see and manipulate the bones easier. Go into pose mode, select one of the tail bones, and then turn on the rotation tool. Now let's see what happens when we try to move this tail. Okay, so what's this weird thing coming out of the shell? Well, that's a part of the model that hasn't had its vertices assigned to any bones, and due to that, it won't move with the rest of the tail. If you look under the floor, you can see this more clearly. The question is, how do we fix this? Because you probably won't want this ugly thing in your shot. There are actually two fixes for this, a quick and easy way, and a slightly harder way that will give you more control of the tail. I'll show you how to do the former first. Select the model, and then go into the Object Data settings, which I'm already in. Now press Tab to go into Edit mode, and then come over here under Vertex Groups. There is a vertex group for every bone on this model, and like selecting vertices via the materials, we can also select them by the bones they are assigned to. If we scroll up this list until we see the tail bones, you will notice that there appears to be a vertex group for a 6th tail bone, despite the bone being non-existent on the model itself. If we click on this, and then press the select button in order to select the vertices in this vertex group, as you would expect, it selects the vertices at the end of the tail, and these include the ones that are stuck in the ground. It was likely that the 6th tail bone somehow disappeared during the ripping process, and the immobile vertices were assigned to this bone. Due to its absence, these vertices can't move with the rest of the tail. So the easy way to fix this is to select the vertices from tail 6, which I've already done, select tail 5, and then press Assign. Now if we tab out of edit mode and rotate the model some more, the ugly tail tower has now disappeared, and we can move the tail without any problems. The only thing is, since we've assigned the 6th tailbone's vertices to the 5th, we lose a little bit of control of the end of the tail. This isn't that big of a deal, but just something to note. That being said, if you want that extra control, I'll show you how to get it now. I've reloaded the blend file, so the model has not had its vertices changed yet, and that weird tail tower still exists. Here's the other fix. Select a bone on the armature, any bone, and then tab into the armature's version of edit mode. We can now edit the armature in any way we wish, but the main reason we're here is to re-add that 6th tailbone. Select the end of the 5th tailbone, not the entire bone, just the tip. Press the E key to extrude a new bone out of this tip, and then right-click to snap it back in place. If you look down at the name of the bone we just created, it has a duplicate number next to it. This is because the newly extruded bone is also called tail 5. Before we change that, it's very important that you select this tool, and then move the bone out very slightly from the end of the tail, just a little. If we don't do this, I'm pretty sure the bone will disappear due to sharing the exact same location with tail 5, but I'm not entirely sure. Regardless, it would be almost impossible to select, so make sure you do this before you select anything else in the 3D view. Okay, now that that's done, we can move on to the bone settings and change the name of our selected bone here. What we're going to change it to is pretty self-explanatory. It's important to note that unlike the names I've made for the other things in this tutorial, you have to name this bone tail 6. It needs to be the exact same name as the vertex group, caps and everything. I'll show you why this is a bit later. For now, let's work on connecting this bone to the rest of the armature properly. Select the first bone that controls the flame, which is called Feeler D1, and go to its parent. Right now it's still the 5th tailbone, but since we have a new bone in between these two, we'll want to switch this parent over to the 6th tailbone. You can either scroll through the list to find it, or alternatively, you could just type the bone's name into the box directly and it should show up. And we're done. If we rotate the tail now, the tower will be gone. We don't have to mess around with the vertex groups for this method. By re-adding the 6th tailbone and giving it the exact same name as the vertex group, Blender will automatically reassign the vertices to the new bone, which allows them to travel with the rest of the tail. The main difference between this one and the last one is that we can rotate our new bone to give us a little bit more control. It's not that big, but every bit of movement can help when animating something. Okay, now on to what you were probably expecting me to go over with this model. The blend textures and animation formulas are the exact same as the rest of the Charizard family, but in order to get the ideal blue flame, you're going to want to use these values for Charizard's core color and these for the shell color. The flames coming from Charizard's mouth don't add any more complexity to the setup, as they move alongside the tail flame. Moving on to Braixen, its setup is the exact same as the Charizard family, with the exception of a slight color difference in the flames. The flames are a slightly lighter color for both the shell and the core. Here are the color values for both of them. All of this applies for Delphox as well. That's all regarding the flame, but if you're going to be animating Braixen or Delphox, here are some things that you'll probably find helpful. Here's the model for Braixen. The flame itself has already been completely set up, but you probably can't see it, or the stick that it's burning on for that matter. So where is it? Well, it's facing downwards below the model. You can get a better look at it if you look underneath the floor. If a Pokemon has an object that they usually hold, like Braixen's stick, it will most likely be set up like this. Not only that, but if we select the stick and move it around a bit, you will see that there's actually 2 different versions of said stick, and they each count as their own objects. The reason there are 2 is because one is supposed to have the flame objects attached to it, while the other one is just the stick alone. For us, it doesn't really matter which stick is which though, because we separate the core and the shell regardless, but that's why there's 2. If you look at the main part of the model, you'll also notice that there's 2 different ear objects, one that's normal and one that appears more aggressive. The teeth are also their own separate object, and so is this weird puff on the tail. So why is this Pokemon made up of so many overlapping objects? The main reason has to do with how the 3DS games handle variations on parts of a model. The game makes certain objects on the model visible or invisible depending on what the character is doing. Now, it may be tempting to just delete the objects you won't be using, but that isn't a very good idea, as you may want to use these variations later. Instead, I'll show you how you can toggle the visibility of these objects. Select the model's armature, and then go up here in the top right corner. This place is called the outliner, and it contains information about all of the objects in your scene. The armature that you've selected should contain the information about the model it's parented to, and, if selected, should appear highlighted. If you've only imported the Braixen model, the armature should simply be called armature. But since I've previously imported models that share the same armature name, it has those numbers next to it. Regardless of what it's named for you, double check down here just to make sure that this is the name of Braixen's armature, and then click this small plus button to the left of the name. Now the outliner will display more information about things related to this armature, including the objects it's parented to, which are signified by these orange triangles. All of the separated objects on Braixen are here, and most of their names should be simple enough to decipher. However, for object names that are a little harder to tell apart, like the ears, all you need to do is go into the 3D viewport and select the object you wish to edit. This will allow you to see its name, as well as highlight it in the outliner itself. So ears B is the spiky form of Braixen's ears. We don't want this to be visible in our render, so using these 3 buttons right next to the object's name, we can make the ears disappear from our scene without deleting it. That way, we can use this in the future if we so desire. So I'll simply turn these properties off, and if we look at the model now, the spiky ears are gone from the scene, and they'll be absent from our render as well. Let's repeat this for any other objects that we don't want visible at the moment. I don't want the teeth to be visible, because Braixen's mouth will be closed, so we'll turn those off, and I also want to disable one of these sticks as well. It doesn't really matter which one, but we just want one of them to be gone. I also don't want this weird hair thing to be here, as Braixen's going to be holding the stick for the render, and this normally only appears when the stick is stashed. Now this model looks a lot nicer, but that doesn't change the fact that the stick, and in turn, the flames, are still stuck in the ground. We could simply move the location of the bone that controls the stick up to Braixen's hand, but then we would need to readjust the stick every time Braixen's hand moves, and I can assure you, that is a nightmare that you'll want to avoid at all costs. So instead, I'm going to use something called a child of constraint, and this is going to make things a million times easier for you. Select the armature once again, and go into pose mode. Then, like any other time we're about to work on an armature, go into the armature settings, turn on X-ray, and if you haven't already made stick your display type, you should probably do that now. The bone that controls the entire stick will have this name for Braixen. For Delphox, there is an R instead of an L. You may find selecting this bone kinda tricky due to its size and location, but if you keep right-clicking around this area, you should eventually get it. Just remember that the object you currently have selected will have its name displayed in the corner, and you should be fine. Anyway, if we press the G key, we can freely move the stick around through this bone, and although we could move it up by Braixen's hand, we'll be using that constraint instead. So with this bone selected, go to the bone constraint settings, and add a new bone constraint. Out of this list, select Child of. There are many options here that we could mess with, but we're only going to be focusing on adding a target. When you click this box, it'll ask for the name of the object that you want to work with this bone. Select Braixen's armature. Not its model, its armature. Remember, the name of the armature could be different for you. If you put in an armature as a target, a new box will show up that will let you select one of its bones. I want Braixen to be holding its stick in its left hand, so inside this box, we'll be selecting Braixen's left hand bone. The stick has automatically moved up towards the hand, and now we can edit its location and rotation in order to make it fit better. I'll rotate the stick negative 90 degrees by pressing RX minus 90, and then I'll adjust its location a bit until it's right below the hand. Now I'll just quickly shift click these finger bones and rotate them around the stick until it fits nicely. And it's done. Braixen is now properly holding the stick. It may look like we could have done this without the constraint, but if we try rotating the arms a bit, the stick will remain connected to the hand, and we won't need to readjust it every 10 seconds while animating, all thanks to the Child of constraint. This constraint can also be applied to other bones on the model too. So for instance, if you want the stick to be stashed instead, just use the bone Feeler K2, the second bone that controls the tail fluff, instead of a hand bone, and then rotate the stick by negative 90 degrees on the x-axis. Hopefully these tips will help you when it comes to animating Braixen or Delphox. Before I move on to Blaziken, I just want to show off something that I forgot about earlier. Let's say that you want the various objects on Braixen or Delphox to appear or disappear mid-animation. Maybe it gets angry during your scene and you want it to display those spiky ears for a bit? Well, to do that, first move to the frame before you want your desired object to appear or disappear. I'll just keep mine at frame 0. Then, go up to the 3 buttons in the outliner that are to the right of the name of said object. With your mouse above one of these 3 buttons, press the I key to insert a keyframe for it. Repeat this for the other 2 buttons. Now that we've added some keyframes to these ears, we can skip ahead 1 frame, disable these display options, and add a second set of keyframes. If we skip back and forth between these 2 frames now, the ears will disappear and reappear in accordance with the keyframes that we've just set. Let's repeat this process for the second pair of ears, only this time, we'll be making them visible so they replace the first pair. Again, keyframe the object's display properties on the frame before you want its visibility to change, move ahead 1 frame, toggle them on, and then keyframe again. Now the ears will appear to change during your animation like so. This same thing can also be applied to a bunch of other models, including ones that don't have flame textures on them at all. But enough with random Braixen stuff, now onto Blaziken. Out of the Pokemon that we'll be focusing on in this video, Blaziken is probably the one who differentiates the most from the norm in terms of its setup. So much so that I'm actually going to go back into Blender to showcase what those differences are. Blaziken's flames come from its wrists, and the way the UV maps are set up, as well as how the textures move, require us to change some notable things. Everything here has already been set up for the render, but I'll still be going over everything that's different. I'll start with the core. The color of the core is the same as the Delphox line, but here are the RGB values again in case you forgot. Everything seems normal now, but if we go into the texture settings, it will become apparent that the alpha textures for Blaziken are somewhat different from the rest of the Pokemon. This has to do with how Blaziken's flames are supposed to move, as well as their unique shape. Again, I've already set up all the textures, so you'll need to import the second textures manually, but that's the same for all of these models. What isn't the same is how fast the offset values move for the core textures. The numbers you're about to see are still what they would normally be for a 300 frame long animation at 30 frames per second. Blaziken's core textures move twice as fast as the core textures on other Pokemon, so you'll want to double the offset that you would normally get from using that formula earlier. As you can see here, the first texture has an offset of -30, double that of -15. Same thing applies if we check out the second texture, -60 instead of the normal -30. So after you have calculated the appropriate offset for your animation, just remember to double that result, which means if your animation is 400 frames long, which would normally make the offset of the first texture -20, double it to -40, and then double this amount again for the second texture to get -80. Even if these textures look different, that's all we need to do regarding them. Now let's move on to the shell. Despite the core sharing its color with the Delphox line, the shell actually shares its color with the Charizard line. So whatever the shell color was for Charizard, use it here. Here are the RGB values again. Let's check out what's different about Blaziken's shell textures. They're also different from the norm. However, they still serve the same function and have the same offset values as the previous Pokemon, so we don't need to change anything about them. That being said, we have Blaziken's mask textures in places where we would normally put the blend textures. So why are we using these and not the blend textures? It has to do with the shape and animation of the flames. Unlike the shells on the rest of the Pokemon, the UV map isn't shaped like a box, and is set up in a specific spiked pattern. Because of this, blend textures will not accurately give us the fading effect that we want, so we need to use the model's mask textures instead. This is the only time so far that this has been required, but luckily, I don't think the blocky fades are as noticeable here, so you shouldn't have to worry about them. You also won't need to worry about the color ramps at all, so that's a plus. As for the individual mask textures themselves, the first one, known as Fire-Type A Mask Alpha, is the one used for subtracting alpha, while the second one, simply called Fire-Type A Mask, is used for adding it. You'll also need to remember to calculate these masks as well. But that's all the things you need to remember for Blaziken. Now let's move on to the last model I'll be covering today, Mega Blaziken. Now you may think that Mega Blaziken uses the same setup as normal Blaziken, but surprisingly, it actually follows the other Pokemon more than it does its own non-Mega evolved state. It uses both the same offset speed and similar textures to Charizard and Braixen, with the only exception being the ramp position on the shell's second blend texture. I found this to give me a better result overall, but you can experiment all you want. What it does share in common with its normal form are the colors on its flame materials. Same RGB values apply here. Now normally that would be it, and we would be done. But unfortunately, there are a few problems with this model that we need to go over real quick. Here's the model not long after import. I haven't set up the flame textures, separated the core and the shell from the model, moved things between layers, or anything like that yet. If you saw what I said about Mega Charizard X, you probably know what this means. In order to see the problem that this model presents, select it, tab into edit mode, and then circle around behind it. Let's try to select all of the vertices that are assigned to the shell material. Select the shell material from the list, and then press this giant select button. Weird. Looks like there's a small diamond-shaped area of the shell that wasn't selected alongside the rest of the vertices. This probably isn't a good sign. If we deselect these vertices, and then go to the core material and select its vertices, the problem should be more apparent. This part is being selected alongside the core, and not with the rest of the shell. You may not be able to see all of the core's vertices now, but if we scroll a bit to the left and turn this button on, we can clearly see that this is what's going on. So now that we know the problem, how do we fix it? Well, we do so in a similar manner to what we did with Mega Charizard X, but instead of vertex groups, we'll be working with materials. Select the shell's material, and then select its vertices, which will help us to see that blind spot. Now down here, we can change how we want to select points on the model. Click this button, which will allow us to select the model by its faces and not by its individual vertices. While holding Shift, right-click these two triangles, so they turn orange alongside the rest of the shell. Now, just make sure you have the shell material selected, which is very important, and then press the Assign button. This will reassign those two faces back to their proper material, and while doing so, deassign them from the core material. We can confirm this by reselecting the model's vertices using these two materials. As you can see, the diamonds now blend with the shell, and if we select the core's vertices, they will not be improperly highlighted anymore. This fixes that problem, but unfortunately, this isn't the end of what we need to do. To see what it is, I'm going to try moving the flame's bones around a bit. I'll quickly get things set up for making adjustments to the pose, which I've already explained how to do. Okay, all set up. Now let's try rotating one of these bottom flame's bones around a bit. Well, that doesn't look good. The problem is very similar to the one with Charizard X, as we have vertices missing from their appropriate vertex groups, but unlike Charizard X, which had faulty vertices not assigned to anything, Mega Blaziken has its vertex groups mixed up with other vertex groups, so fixing this may take a little bit more effort. First, you'll want to make a mental or physical note as to what the title of this bone chain is. If we select the first bone in the chain, we can see that its name is Feeler M1, so by extension, the second bone in the chain will be called Feeler M2, third will be M3, and so on. Armed with this knowledge, select the model, and then go into edit mode once again. Make sure you're in the object data settings to the right, which I currently am. Down under here in the vertex groups, search for the names that we made note of earlier. Here they are, the Feeler M bones. Like the materials, you can use one of these groups in order to have Blender select the vertices relating to this bone. If we select the first bone in the chain, we won't be able to immediately see the problem, but if we take a look at the vertices inside the shell, something now looks a little out of place. There are some vertices later down the line that are assigned to this vertex group for some reason. Furthermore, the ones right underneath the shell aren't assigned to it at all. Looks like this is what's causing those weird movement patterns from earlier. If you select the vertices for the fifth bone in the chain, you can see that the roles have been somewhat reversed. Now for the fix. Once again, select the first bone in the chain and display its vertices. In the 3D port, press the B key in order to start a box select, hold Shift, and create a box around all of the orange vertices near the top part of the flame object. Doing this will allow us to manually deselect the vertices inside the box, and leave us with this part down here alone. We'll want to remove this part from this vertex group, because unlike the materials, vertices can be assigned to multiple groups, so we'll need to remove this manually. This can be done simply by having your bone name selected from the list, and then pressing the Remove button. Make absolutely sure that you have the correct group and vertices selected before you do this, as it could cause some even bigger problems otherwise. These vertices may be out of place with the first bone, but not with the fifth one, so let's select its group, and then press the Assign button. If we take a look at the vertices for the fifth bone now, we can see that this part fits perfectly underneath the shell, so we were able to bring it back to its proper group. All that's left to do is to do that again with this part up here. Like before, Shift box select these vertices so we're left with these out of place vertices by themselves, and then press the Remove button on this vertex group. Now go back up to the first bones group and press Assign. And done. The model's vertices are now assigned to their proper vertex groups, and the flames will now rotate properly. Everything can go on as normal. Remember, it's very important to do all of this before you separate your flame objects, otherwise this will be almost impossible to fix. And that's all the Pokemon I can cover at this moment. I'm sorry if I didn't go over a Pokemon you wanted to use, like Ponyta or Moltres, but when I'm able to get those flames working, and the ability for you to do the same is easily accessible, I will come back and explain how to do the rest of the Pokemon. Thank you for your patience. Before I sign out, I will quickly go over how to composite one of these flames into live action, as a little more setup in the node editor will be required in order to do so. Back to Charizard as a placeholder, What you're seeing here is a different blend file from the rest of the tutorial, because if you're going to make a live action render, you will want to get your footage all set up before you start messing around in the node editor. Besides that, in the ground plane, everything else relating to the flames is set up. The material colors and animations, the render layers, the shadow scene, everything. All that's left to do flame-wise is the node editor, but before I do that, I'm going to import my footage into the movie clip editor. I go over how to do this in my first tutorial, but I'll go over it again in brief detail just in case you haven't seen it. Click this button here, and retrieve your movie clip from your computer. Here's mine, just a basic shot on a tripod, nothing special, and it remains still throughout the entire recording, so we won't need to worry about camera tracking. If your footage doesn't move like mine, which I would recommend if you're starting out with live action compositing, you can go up to the Solve tab, turn on Tripod, and then click Solve Camera Motion. Now that it's calculated our non-existent camera motion, we can go down here to set the footage as a background, and then set up the tracking scene. This button here is what requires us to work with a different node setup, but click it regardless. You'll see why this is later. For now, let's get back to the 3D view. By setting up the tracking scene, Blender will automatically give us a ground plane to work with. This is why I didn't add one earlier, because they would have overlapped with each other. It's quite small, however, so let's scale it up a bit so it'll catch all of our shadows. We'll also want to give it a material, and just like the plane we used during the tutorial, set its specular to 0, then scroll down, and give it a pass index. Again, I'm going to set mine to 10. Also make sure that you turn on Receive Transparent before you move on. Now that our ground plane is set up, we can move it to the shadow scene without any problem. So let's go ahead and press Ctrl L, and then select the shadow scene. Let's also go over to the shadow scene ourselves to make one more adjustment. Our plane doesn't appear to be here, and that's because it's on a different layer, even back in the main scene. While it's important that this plane remains in its own layer in the main scene, it's not necessary here. So we can go down to our boxes in order to display the layer the plane is on, which will always be in the bottom left corner. Select the plane and move it to the top left layer. Now the plane is in the same layer as everything else, at least in the shadow scene. Before we head back to the main scene, you will probably want to go to the render layer settings and turn sky off. Back in the main scene now, let's take a look at our preview render to see where we currently stand. So the tail flame isn't there, but that's to be expected considering the flame objects are on other layers and we haven't set up our nodes yet. The main thing to take note of is the lighting. Setting up the tracking scene will automatically change your environment lighting and ambient occlusion to a preset value, so if you've already set your values there, they'll no longer exist. Don't worry though, you could just go back to the world settings and simply put your desired lighting values back in. For this render, I'll make the AO 0.5 and the environment lighting 0.4. Looks a lot better now, wouldn't you say? There's one last thing I need to show off before we hop into the node editor. If you check out the render layer settings, you will notice that we have two render layers that we didn't add ourselves, foreground and background. Like a lot of other things that I've gone over, this is due to the tracking scene. Foreground is basically a copy of our main render layer with a few additional settings enabled in order to work with live action. We won't be needing this layer here, so you can just delete it by selecting it from the list and then pressing this minus button. Even though we won't be using the foreground layer itself, we're going to add those settings I was talking about earlier to the main layer. So make sure the main layer is selected, and then turn on the vector pass. We'll also want to set this box as a mask layer, because this box is assigned to the background and contains our plane, which we won't want visible in our final render. As for the other layers, go into the cores and enable the vector pass there as well. After that, go into the background layer and enable material index. With all that out of the way, let's finally hop into the node editor to see what's different. I'll switch it over to scene once again, and yeah. Setting up the tracking scene will automatically add all of these nodes to your scene without your input. As a matter of fact, This setup here is used every time you make a live action shot. So if some of you guys have seen my previous tutorials and were doing live action clips, then you were using these nodes without even thinking about it. Nice job. Unfortunately, that means we're going to have to integrate our flame setup into this live action setup. It's a lot of the same, but I recommend that you still pay very close attention, as we're still going to have to deal with some new things. Before we start, quickly render your image so you can give yourself a backdrop to work with. Like before, we need to turn on this backdrop button in order to see our render. Much better. Now we can get into the crazy stuff. I'm going to zoom out and spread some of these nodes far apart from each other. We're going to need all that extra space. Head down to this node here, which is just our main render layer node, and duplicate it twice, just like last time. Once again, change these nodes so that they use our core and shell render layers. Up here, we have the nodes that work with the background layer. Because of these nodes, we can put shadows on the ground without having a plane in our shot. Box select all of these nodes and then duplicate them below the original. We're also going to want to move these back a little bit. Switch the original version of the render layer node so it displays our shadow scene. You've probably noticed that Charizard's shadow has disappeared. Don't worry, it'll be back once we're all done with this setup. In the meantime, if we render our image once again, we can see that our core shadow is on the ground, so that's pretty neat. Back down to our three main layers, let's once again start creating the setup for combining the shell and the core together. Here's where things start to change a bit. The tracking scene adds a node to our setup called Vector Blur, a really useful node that lets you create and control motion blur, to an extent. The problem lies with combining multiple layers with motion blur. It can be kind of tricky to get more than one layer to blur at the same time, so how do we integrate our flame into this? First, simply link the alpha over node into the Vector Blur's image slot. Next, we are going to want to add a new type of node by going to Add, Color, and then Z combine. Place it down, and then connect the Z paths from both our main and core layers into two separate Z slots on the node. Now, connect the Z from the Z combine node and the Vector Blur node together. Duplicate the Vector Blur node and place it right in the path of the original, so the two can automatically connect to each other. We need to use two of these because of the separate render layers. For the second Vector Blur node, once again connect its Z slot with the Z combine nodes, and then all the way over here, use the core layer's speed, aka vector pass, for the speed slot of this node. Now we're pretty much done with this bottom part. All we need to do is connect the core's alpha pass to the add node's FAC slot, which is another way to make the outside part of the shell disappear, by the way, and then go up and turn on Convert Primo on the final alpha over node to make the flame look even better. So our flame is now fully visible in the render, and even though you can't see it here, the motion blur on both the model and the flame should look fine. Let's fix these shadows now. Duplicate one of these multiply nodes, and put it in front of both of the backgrounds nodes and the shadow scenes nodes. Combine the multiply nodes of both sets using this newly created node like so, and then link it to the bottom slot of this multiply node. We have our main shadow back now, and the core's is still there, but we still want to be able to control how dark the core's shadow is, so let's once again add our barrage of math nodes. Nothing has really changed since last time, and this might take a minute or so please enjoy some music as I do some multiplication. hope you enjoyed the music. Our 4 math nodes are all set up like before, but where do we connect them to? The answer is this multiply node up here, the one that is linked with the shadow scene. Remember to connect them through the node's FAC slot and not the image slots. Just like before, we can now control how bright the core's shadow is using the node's number value, and we can have it match our scene. But with that, our node setup is now finally done. All that's left to do is to animate and render our video. This will also bring this video to a close. Thank you guys so much if you managed to stick around and watch all of it. Hopefully I was able to teach you guys how this whole flame thing works. This project was a long time in the making, and I'm glad I could finally put this question to rest, at least for a good chunk of Pokemon. If you still have any questions at this point, or things didn't go as they were shown here, please feel free to leave a comment on this video about it. If anything changes or needs to be revised between the time of this upload and the time that you're watching this, I will have a pinned comment that will go over it. Thanks again for watching. Bye.